All right. I talked earlier. I'll come back to me later. You guys, Bernie's out. First reactions, thoughts, reflections.
I mean, I was just saying to Matt, it's obviously it's really devastating. Bernie Sanders really meant so much to so many people. My mom texted me. She said that she was crying. I mean, it's sad. It's definitely a moment where we're seeing something that we put a lot of effort and work into, collapsing. But at the same time, as not to trying to be overly optimistic about this. Obviously, I'm feeling the pain as much as everyone else. It means that we have a mobility going forward. We have a lot of opportunities and what kind of strategies that we're going to be putting forward over the next couple weeks, and then over the long term. It looked like it was coming for a long time. Basically, it's a weird time for anything to be going on. Obviously, with everybody in quarantine at a time when the world feels like it's in complete flux. I mean, we're all, a lot of people, not everybody, but a lot of people are sort of holed up in their homes, and it feels like history in the world and all these things have stopped, but they're still continuing. So I don't know. I mean, I think we'll get into some of. I mean, there's a part of me too that just like I'm very invigorated personally right now because I just feel like this is a time for strategy and for bold perspectives and to really be pushing forward. So I have a lot of energy and excitement putting into that, but obviously this is a massive setback, and I don't think there's any use in saying anything other than that it's a massive setback for us in our movement, and we have to keep barreling forward though.
I was gonna get to Matt. We should go to you. I just like David's like, we just gotta keep fucking going. Let's go.
Yeah, that's it. That's the.
By the way, the left needs more of that energy. All right.
That's the Nixon. Just put your head down and barrel through the underbrush. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to sound like a hipster when it comes to like Bernie depression, but like after that night, I think this might have been the same night, Michael, you were in Los Angeles. I think it was the night he basically won California, but nothing else. Was that this? Am I to have that memory right? It's like,
yeah, I mean, he might have won a few other states, but I mean, California was the huge win,
was
and
good,
then it was
but
devastating. I mean, it was Biden took Massachusetts, Biden took Texas. It was a bad night.
It seemed
that
like
was it.
It wasn't happening.
That was that was it. Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, we'll probably talk about specific things that what ifs as this goes on, but as far as who has things to learn from this, or I mean, who is culpable here, like I do think it is on party leadership. Like this whole discussion we're having now about Biden being the nominee and this nervousness about whether current affairs will do enough to turn the left out for Biden. Like, I mean, I think it's ridiculous, but it's clearly like this we were put intentionally in this position by the party leadership. So this is what the party leadership has decided that is going to happen. And so I hope they can beat Trump with Biden. I hope this all turns out for the best. But like I don't know, like it's just content for a type of person that that would rather talk about how well Obama polls than his culpability in steering the ship into disaster.
Yeah, I mean, I saw Joy Reid drop a couple of one of the things that's great is that this guy and this gal get back on the trail, and it's a couple of kind of gifs of Barack and Michelle like in campaign mode, and it's like Joy, and this is what really just keeps driving me crazy with like the right wing or the corporate or the Democratic establishment, whatever word we're using, is like, you are aware that you lost 2016 with that, right? Like, I mean, these are literally gifts that you might be using of them going out during you losing the race to Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what kind of like mystic capacity we're talking about here, but I mean, I'll keep, banging the drum that I did, and will continue to. I think the left has a huge amount of work to do on itself. Mm-hmm. I think that if you want to be a mass movement, you got to be a mass movement. And there needs to be a jettisoning of, and this is why we focused on things like the Vampire Castle and stuff like that. Look, it's garbage in and of itself, and it's a very unhelpful and bad way of being and doing things inside a small community. So that has innate value to critique. But the bigger implication of critiquing stuff like that is basically, are you building something that's fit for purpose?
Yeah.
Are you building something that can, translate and go out? And I'll just say like something, this is another thing. Like, we know people in the Sanders campaign, and I think I'll keep using this analogy. It could totally be that 95% of what happened here is cable news, overwhelming propaganda, Democratic Party just synchronized, like, just complete unprecedented coordination to stop a single candidate, and a couple of other things that are really not in the Sanders campaign's control. But my thing is like, even if it's 5%, you got to look at your 5%. And I think one of the things that we could have done, and this is where, it's not even, I don't even care, honestly, about continuing to relitigate Elizabeth Warren. If you want to keep posting snakes, I think that's great. I think that's funny. I don't care. But I honestly think that conversation's over. I think it needed to happen. I think I was relatively early on it. I wish I was earlier. But the point was like, the way in which the left has gotten so inside a certain type of very narrow professional managerial class and liberal discourse and cultural practice, I think, it not only had the effect of the campaign of kind of like fighting online with, a fifth place finisher, but not looking at the proper terrain, which was that this was always a race between Sanders and Biden. And it was disturbing how many people on the liberal or on the left were just sure Biden was going to go. I thought Biden was going to go when it actually looked like he was literally going, like he started getting his ass kicked in Iowa. But before then, I always thought it was just silly to discount Biden. And I think if the real attitude was, there's an upmarket pool of Democratic voters that really care about electability and also have a certain set of, they're the bougie whatevers, and a lot of those folks really hate Bernie Sanders, versus maybe actually a much broader and older, but in some ways more analogous to the real broad working class coalition that Bernie did assemble with younger people. And you much earlier just focused the campaign on Biden. And that would include definitely different messaging in some areas. I think some more message discipline amongst some of the surrogates and things like that. But also, and other things like attacking Biden's risk as a general election candidate. And I just think that I also want the left to develop a greater capacity to just look at certain things in value neutral ways. Like, it's not right, it's not wrong, it's whatever. It's just politics. Like, what is the play to appeal to folks that aren't where we are? And what's the best way of being appealing? I think we do need to have these conversations. I also, it's terrible. Really sucks. It's really painful. It was a hugely important race. The only other thing I want to just point to, I'll stop in a second, but I do also want to say that I'm going to keep hitting this theme, and please watch the interview we did with Chris Smalls. It was amazing. And the work he's doing with Amazon is extraordinary. And the Teamsters that we shouted out in Philly and the GoFundMe that you could help them with. I think that, several months ago, kind of like vague talk of general strikes and mass insurrectionary action was not a real thing. I mean, there were shoots of it. There were things that were occurring, starting with the teacher strikes, and those were incredibly important. But there wasn't something that you really could see congealing into a kind of mass outpouring in a really concrete way. Well, now you can. So we're actually in an interesting position because we're in a horrible condition right now economically and with the pandemic. But we've had a really important door closed on us, and it's really bad, and we shouldn't be naive about how bad it is. But I also think that there is an opening in the realm of labor and strikes and basically class mobilization that I don't think was there even, say, a month ago, let alone 5 months ago. And that provides real opportunity.
I mean, there's so much to, I think in a little bit we should talk more about like what we think the strategy going forward. Now it's looking back for a couple minutes just to see where we were. I think the moment that we were looking toward Elizabeth Warren and the Elizabeth Warren um, supporters to sort of push us forward, we had lost at that point.
Right.
And I think that was a problem that I think goes back to what you were saying, which is a kind of problem with this kind of like upstream PMC voting class that is so prevalent within the Democratic Party and the media world. But I think I think you were right to point out the fact that they missed Biden's appeal, because the kind of fights that were happening in New York Magazine and these kind of hoity-toity papers were very different from what was going on the ground. I'll just say from my experience, being, from like working class communities in South Carolina and in Texas, one thing that was really difficult about the Bernie campaign was this. I hit this just because I want people to understand where there's potential and where we made mistakes when it came to Bernie's movement with the working class. People in those communities really resonated with Bernie's message. They like ideas like Medicare for all. They hate their boss. They are prepared for class warfare and class conflict. But you know what I would hear constantly? Well, Bernie can't win. And I think that when we were talking about this on the show yesterday, when people are voting against Bernie or voting for Biden over Bernie, a lot of times there's a calculus there, which is a kind of making a decision like, you know what, the Democratic Party and all these people are going to do everything they can to stop this person from coming into power. And I'm making this decision because I think putting them forward will actually make things worse because, they will allow like the right winger to come into power. I think we should have that in our calculus. But I think, there were mistakes when it comes to Warren. I think one lesson that we have to learn is that there's a very clear divide between a kind of like progressive liberalism and democratic or socialist politics, populist politics that we're trying to do. There are some people who have been very comfortable for a long time, and they do not like the idea of everyday people coming into power. It's actually antithetical to their social status and their economic position. And just lastly, I mean, I know these are sort of a myriad of different points, but lastly, I think that one thing, and this is just this is just how politics works, and it might be a little bit of a trivial analysis to make, but I really wish that there was a little bit more. There was a lot of focus in the Bernie campaign about how wrong things are, about how Walmart and Amazon. I love that Bernie Sanders was very prepared to come after Bezos and come after like the Waltons and come after these organizations by name. And there was a lot of focus basically on how working people are taken advantage of. But I think I would have liked to see a little bit more of a celebration of the fact that labor creates all value in the society, or labor creates the value in the society, and we have tremendous power, right? And I think that like if we were to hit that a little bit more, I don't know. There's this Alabama song that's literally just like Alabama's a great country music band. And it's like 40-hour week. And it's literally just like a long list of like, thank you, Detroit auto workers. Thank you, Pittsburgh steel workers, like really celebrating the working class and all that they do for us as a society. I felt like we could have done a little bit more on that because we're seeing those people now flexing their muscle with this strike wave that's going on across the country because they're recognizing their power. And I just think we could have been a little bit more outspoken before the crisis, for example, of basically showing these people like, we have this political power in the workplace to fundamentally change the society because you are what makes this entire society function.
Yeah. But I mean, that's funny you say that because I think that there is a real radicalism to that, but that's actually a great normie message.
Yeah, that's what the Republicans do.
And you need to do that. And also, you need to also acknowledge that people's personal ambition is okay, people's desire to improve their livelihoods, that when that is like, when we're critiquing and talking about the culture of oligarchy and excess, that's like the pure moral indignation. But 99, a vast majority of voters are thinking of aspiration. Some of them obviously have bought into some consumeristic whatever we can critique, although I don't know that you want to spend a campaign doing that. But a lot of it is really that, like I mean, just look at how ruthless America is. Like, you need to have some kind of entrepreneurial vision of yourself, mostly if you want to even just provide the basics. I always remember this great interview with Eddie Murphy where he's like, my parents did an amazing job in some ways shielding me growing up because I was obsessed with becoming wealthy when I was growing up. And I thought that I was trying to make the jump from middle class. But what I realized retrospect was like, I was actually super poor. I just didn't really know it. And the stuff that I wanted to get away from was not being middle class. It was being like broke.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, that's the experience of a lot of folks. And I think that, anyway, Matt, go ahead.
I mean, yeah, just kind of to David's I think previous point about the PMC class and all that sort of thing. Like, I think it's just funny how we still have people saying the lesson for the left is that Bernie's people need to be more nice and not like just an amazing caricature of sort of technocracy and how they played themselves. I mean, the resistance to that lesson, like if anybody should be able to learn something, it's the people who were overly educated into thinking that we can do something with Warren better than we can do with Bernie. And I mean, like David said, like put the people first. And I know I keep bringing this up, but we all have our axes to grind. But Warren says, Bernie has today, when she tweeted him out for dropping his campaign, said it like, good job for all you've done for working families or something like that. She used the phrase working families in the tweet. And just like after the whole like rank and file vote suppression thing there and how that like her playing that game was supposed to be the signal that she was the real leftist candidate. And look where it got us. It got us like down a rabbit hole that we never recovered from. So like those groups, those people are who need to learn something from this right now, I think, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and I think though that what's interesting is that it's very, very clear that if we want to build some type of mass left, whatever project, something that really says something, let's just be simple, a 99% politics, right? I actually think that's not a bad formulation. I think obviously there's subtlety and nuances and other ways you could say it's a 10 versus 90 or whatever. But I think there's a real truth that like there is like 1%. And honestly, I start to sound like Bernie, but maybe even maybe even a tenth of that 1% that is like in the Elysium world. And everybody else, including first and foremost poor and working people who deal with this every single day and are grinded out in our economy and politics. And that's almost half, if not more, of the population in some respects. Then there's like a barely clawing on middle class. And then there's even a lot of people who have some, decent amount of comfort, but it isn't actually that resilient, in the grand scheme of things. That a movement that really does say, look, this is about the many, not the few. And it is absolutely about the many, not the few in all categories. That means a robust and clear policy on civil rights and equity. But at the same time, I think, again, a lot of, just all the petty stuff that we talk about. But unfortunately, I don't want, believe it or not, to talk about who Joe Rogan endorsed. Like in a sane world where we're constructing a win, that literally just gets registered as a data point. Oh, that's awesome. Our guy got the most popular podcaster. There's one for us. Also somebody who represents the center of voters. Boom, that's it. There's nothing more to that conversation. Nothing. And, I think you're going to have a lot of conversations now where there's going to be some real stock of just how narrow the appeal of the PMC is, and also the reality that a lot of PMC voters do not care. They can pay lip service to any number of things, whether it's urgent human rights issues like what's happening at the border, or even, tipping to the hat to mass structural economic issues. Big structural Bailey and that, right. But at the end of the day, we know that that's most of what those voters are just not about that life. And they're also fundamentally like, and there's analogies to this. I mean, look, he's a much more interesting figure, but Ciro Gomez in Brazil finished third in the runoff, has a deep resentment of Lula. He's an intellectual. He's an academic. He's, I mean, I have to say, significantly more impressive politician than Warren. But like, there's obviously a part of him that resents the hell out of the fact that a union leader that didn't go to college, who is plain spoken, is an infinitely more successful person than he is in politics. And it's an attitude that is going to have to say, like, even this, like, I forget, someone was critiquing this idea, even like this rhetoric of organizing. Like, okay, so you parachute in and organize other people. You don't know what other people want. You don't know how other people live. There needs to be, and again, I think the cutoffs are really obvious. I think the cutoffs are like the global cutoffs. You go to places in the Middle East, which I've spent, a lot of time in. On one hand, relatively speaking, and I'll finish this quick. On one hand, and I've, you resist the Sam Harrises and all of these assholes of the world, that there's an enormous diversity of political opinion in these places. There are, in a place like Turkey, there was definitely a lot of LGBTQ activism. There is a whole Muslim queer and transgender world. And, the neocons erased that. And conversely, there's a hell of a lot of people that it's like, they don't, they're not cool with gay people. And that's it. Simple. And that's a disagreement. That is a real tangible political disagreement about rights. And that's something that we're going to have. On the other hand, there's, I'm sorry, I'm not going to go somewhere and mandate like, oh, well, you need to get with the modern world, so everybody needs to wear the same clothing. You need to get with the modern world. You need to embrace, sex before marriage or whatever. Like, there is a part, I mean, these are extreme examples, but I think that there is a liberal closedness with basically other people's just way of life that manifests in speech. It manifests sometimes in different tangible attitudes about controversial issues. Manifests in guns. It manifests in, gender stuff, all sorts of things. And I'm just, really, again, of like, can we simplify and go back to like the Freedom Charter of the African National Congress, like clear bedrock rights and dignity for all is not the same as mandated ways of being or governance or trying to force everybody else into very particular subcultures. And just as like most people don't want to join a megachurch, like most people don't find you trying to drag them into your cult appealing. Now, then, and by the way, if you're doing the Moonies, that's fine, because all you need is 5 million people or less. I just listened to a good Grubstakers episode on this, to make a fuck ton of money and have sushi chains in New York hotels. But if you want to elect Bernie Sanders president, you want to revive the labor movement, you got to become infinitely more like horizontal and relational with the mass of people,
I think you're hitting on something, and let me just put it in a kind of historical context too. That I think, because I think where this argument at this point, I should say, gets lost on folks. Who has always been way more advanced when it comes to issues of like gender, race, and sexuality than the majority of the population? It's been the socialists and the communists. Literally, that was the first charge that was laid against them. You read the kind of radical stuff that was happening, for example, in the early Soviet Union before Stalin took over. And remember that Stalin literally, not only was, Stalin very much against a lot of the kind of like radical socialist ideas that we support, Stalin put in all these like really harsh family laws, right? He actually returned to a very conservative idea of like the family, reversed access to abortion and all these things, right? So you just have to understand the context of like what Stalin actually meant toward the Soviet Revolution. But the early Soviet Revolution was radically progressive on all of these issues. You look at the United States, right? You look at, the socialist communist parties were always the first people fighting for gay rights, fighting for trans rights, fighting, you look at the Alabama Communist Party in the Deep South, fighting for the rights of African Americans in this country. So it's not a question, for example, about fighting or being prepared to fight for these rights. What liberalism does, liberalism sees social problems And it thinks, instead of dealing with these in a material way, let's deal with everything in a symbolic way. And that is the kind of politics that we're seeing now, right? So it's not actually about empowering people from marginalized communities, right? It's about recognition. It's literally, it's like, I'm not gonna do anything about your bank account. I'm not even gonna really step in with the way that your boss is treating you, but you know what? I see you. And like,
But then the extension of that, I agree completely.
yeah.
But the extension of that is two other things that are a little bit more tricky to tease out, but we have to. And one is that when you really lean on that discourse, then things that are, again, I use this example: the guy who's making $18,000 a year in post-industrial Ohio can be described as privileged. I'm sorry, that's
Exactly.
crazy. That's
No, I mean,
fucking ridiculous. Or the other thing too, and I think this is and this is like the really, again, very clear pivot distinction. I have a Marxist position that I think a global Marxism has to be rooted in global sources. That's clearly a mission of this show, internationalism. I think that covers human liberation in the fullest sense. So in other words, I don't think a lot of these different discourses and I think they often obscure and mystify more than clarify. And they lead to a lot of bullshit, right? Like, and also I think the other thing too that I would say is, I think on the realm of interpersonal toxic attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, these things, I think honestly, that's where the spiritual stuff comes in. That's where self-practice comes in. That's where these different methodologies of like detoxifying yourself from culture or whatever, I think that's totally valid, but I don't really think that that's politics. And I think that a lot of therapeutic stuff, a lot of things that people may or may not choose to take on in specific contexts, has gotten funneled into mass projects in a way that hurts, the ability to actually do it. Now, again, to be really, really clear, because I can see people, taking it like out of context or whatever, is that again, going back to the ANC Freedom Charter, if you don't have actual basic buy-in to rights, dignity, and equity as broadly defined in a very like a traditional sense that you'd see, I keep citing the ANC, then you're just not even in the group to begin with, right? Like that the lines are actually really quite easy. Somebody said like, hey, I want to organize with you guys, but we're gonna, I can't have equity with different people from backgrounds. Well, okay, you can't. Like you're not here. Now, if you at home are, Jewish or Muslim or Christian or whatever, and you have a particular belief or whatever, I'm sorry. I'm just not interested in policing that. It's not my belief. It's not my ideal world, but I am not in the politics of policing that. I don't think that's productive for us.
Well, I guess like what I would say is, I think the distinction there's a very important distinction that needs to be made, right? Where there's a kind of like liberal discourse politics that thinks that what we need to do is we need to get all of these people into a room and just have a real nice, good, long chat, right? Like we just need to have a real good chat, and like I recognize you and your experience, and I recognize their experience, etc. Right? And that's fundamentally different from the politics that we're trying to put forward. The politics that I'm trying to put forward is saying like, you know what? I don't think that you should be able to exploit somebody's labor. You know what? I don't think that it's right that you're able to use the threat of the police, the threat of the landlord, the threat of all of these punitive social systems to keep certain populations in the United States down so that you can exploit their labor at a higher rate than you can other groups, right? Like these are fundamentally different perspectives of how we're dealing with a social problem. We are trying to break the ties of exploitation that are like very much connected to these systems of racial, gender, and sexuality oppression. It's completely different perspectives. And I think to take it back to the Bernie moment and the Bernie Warren thing is that's exactly the distinction that you had between their campaigns, right? Like, and I think that was sort of, unfortunately, was an issue that we saw with the Warren Bernie campaign when the Bernie campaign was trying to like out woke the Warren movement, for example, right? Because that's not where our politics are mobilizing, right? Our politics are mobilizing in the concrete material way to people that were saying like, you know what, there's people who are preventing you from being able to live a fulfilled life. There's people who are oppressing you, and we're going to create politics that can challenge that.
And also it allows us, you need to have the capacity to update circumstances. So even like when people talk about, you know, like the mode of production of capitalism is not the same as it was in the 1950s, right?
Yeah.
So there is an aspect obviously that's patriarchal because of the undervaluing of work that is traditionally given still to this day to women. So that is an accurate piece of analysis. On the other hand, sometimes people use analytic frameworks that were built in a time when we were doing Fordism, and the idea was that one person works and one person stays home, where starting in the 60s because of social movements, but aggressively expanding in the 70s, 80s, and 90s because of economics, nobody can stay at home and everybody has to go to work. Now, of course, that's generally a good, I mean, I think actually people's overall diminished livelihoods and like
I
the
actually think it's bad.
were really bad.
Patriarchy was good, but like the fact that the family
But
can't
the fact
function
that
on that,
the family can't
yeah.
function is a really important countervailing force to understand. And also, to the extent it was good, of course, part of it was good. A major, like, again, it wasn't happening because people were getting more enlightened. That was part of it, but a lot of it was happening because of the economic demand. So then it's like, okay, so how do we talk about capitalism in a way that's appropriate for 2020? Like the analytic, you know, models are different, you know, like, so, you know, I just think that is where at some point in my whatever, my worldview, you got to get to either two bases. You either have to get to the ultra material base of everything, or get to the touchy-feely stuff or whatever, which is like empathy. How do you cultivate it?
Yeah.
What are the barriers to it? These are questions that are more preoccupied in religion, philosophy, whatever. And I think they're really damn relevant. I certainly do. But I think from a political and economic framework, that materialist standpoint is, I think it's the engine. I do. I mean, obviously, you know, we're not going to just be totally crude base superstructure, but especially in the United States, we need a lot more base superstructure across the board because we're so ideational. You just watched a Michael Brooks show video. Subscribe to get them all. Why wouldn't you? Don't be foolish. Click subscribe below and become a patron as well. Patreon.com/TMBS. Thanks, everybody.